begin now with our first speaker, Marcus Allen. Now, in 1969, those of you who are around who are old enough to remember this, and you will know that one of the biggest events in the media was the landing of astronauts on the moon. We saw men walking on the moon. It's one of the greatest events. It's been described as the greatest event in human history. But is everything as it seems? Were we told the truth about what happened? Marcus Allen will be informing us of that. So put your hands together for Marcus Allen.
Thank you. What a delightful start. I hope it's as enthusiastic at the end, because I'm going to deconstruct, as Ben said, one of 20th century's greatest events as a non-event. That what we saw was not what we were told it was. Because you can fool some of the people all the time. You can fool all the people some of the time. And you can fool all the people all the time if your special effects budget is big enough. So we're going to have a look at the special effects budget. Not the budget, the special effects. But before we do that, as Ben said, I'm the UK distributor for Nexus magazine. And there are two types of people in the world: those who read Nexus and those who are about to. We have over on the stand some extra copies. This is the latest issue. There are previous issues. You may not recognize this cover if you've been a Nexus subscriber and reader for a long time, because we changed the cover. It's an Australian magazine. We distribute and print it in the UK. It's now available in America as well. So anybody listening from America, go to Barnes & Noble, you'll find it there. End of commercial. Because I only do this for the money. As many people say, I wish it was for the money. This is not the way to get rich, guys. This is the way to find interesting things down the rabbit hole. Okay, you may recall a gentleman with the name of Carl Sagan, who was a very good communicator, and he popularized one particular phrase: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is a very sensible thing to say. So what we're going to look at is some of the claims for the moon landings, because in the moon landings there are many strange anomalies, inconsistencies, and unexplained details. We're going to be having a look at some of that. Because if this was the event we're told it was, it should stand up to scrutiny. It should be able to stand up to any investigation. Let's start with the investigation. This is where it completed. National Geographic, the world's top-selling magazine at the time. This is the edition from December 1969. Now, to many people, this is all going to be history. This is all something that happened 50-odd years ago. December this year is the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8, which orbited the moon, we're told. And they read the book of Genesis, and everybody got upset. And you've got this phenomena where we're being forever told that Apollo was the great start of the space race. Going back to 1961, the date on that is April the 21st, 1961. Life magazine, another American publication, with on the left Yuri Gagarin, on the right Nikita Khrushchev, who was then time president of the Soviet Union, which is now a defunct country. It's called the Russian Federation today. But it was that event of Yuri Gagarin orbiting the moon which spurred America, in the shape of President John Kennedy, to make his famous announcement in May 1961, 6 weeks later, 6 weeks after Gagarin had done his orbit. Kennedy had to come up with something. He'd only been president for 4 months at that point. His inauguration was in January 1961. Young, dynamic, charismatic president and Russia was showing them up something rotten. So he had to make an announcement. We're going to land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him safely to the Earth. That was his promise. Of course, 2 and a bit years later, Kennedy was assassinated. We still don't know who by, but he was assassinated. But at the time he made the announcement in 1961, a lot was going on in America and around the world. We had the so-called space race. There was no race. It was a media invention to sell newspapers, basically. America and the Soviet Union at the time were cooperating. You may recall Operation Paperclip, where it's called Operation Paperclip because a new description of the Nazi scientists imported into America had a new CV paperclipped onto their visa application, say that they were good people and they weren't Nazis. They were Nazis. Werner von Braun was a major in the SS. Hermann Oberth was a senior scientist. They were all Germans who got America to the moon. They were all Nazi Germans, as it happened. Then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis in October '62. Then you have President Kennedy getting shot. You have the Vietnam War ramping up. Kennedy wanted America out of Vietnam. It's interesting that a year after his assassination, the number of American troops in Vietnam had increased 10 times under President Johnson. The student riots were rioting against the Vietnam War because they didn't want America in it. 58,000 Americans died as a result of this ridiculous war. And a piece of trivia, by the way, the Vietnam War was started as a result of what is known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where American naval forces were attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. There were no torpedo boats, there was no attack. It was a complete misreading of the radar signals, but it was too late. 58,000 Americans would die, 3 million North Vietnamese would die. That is the price of incompetence at high level. The commander of the American fleet at the Gulf of Tonkin was a guy by the name of Admiral George Morrison. His son was Jim Morrison of the Doors. If you check out Laurel Canyon is a road north of Los Angeles where many of the musicians, the early musicians in the 1960s, Frank Zappa, who's one of the most prominent musicians, lived. It's very close to where the murders took place of Sharon Tate. And there's also, on Laurel Canyon, a place called Lookout Mountain Studios. It's now a private house owned by Gerard Leto, the actor and musician, but it was prior to that the main US Air Force studios, film studios, where a considerable amount of this information came from. Anyway, that's where we're going to go. We're going to go to the moon. This is a photograph taken in the mid-1950s. It's one of the best series of the lunar photographs taken by the Lick Observatory. And at that place there, that's where Apollo 11 is alleged to have landed. But in order to land on the moon, they had to have a space program to do it. It started with Mercury, which was 1 man in space, Gemini, 2 men in space, Apollo 3 men, Skylab a little bit more, the shuttle, flying up to 7 astronauts at a time, the ISS, International Space Station. The current program is the Orion program. Now, how many people here know what the X-37B is? Ben knows. Yeah. There's the X-37B. Anybody know where it goes to? It flies in space. Its last mission was 712 days. Nobody knows where it goes. They're not telling us. The previous mission to that was 18 months. It could go to Mars. I don't know if it does or not. Nobody knows where it goes. So let's not have any idea here that people can't keep secrets if they need to. Of course they can. Apollo needed a big piece of kit to get to the moon with a big rocket. The one on the left is the Saturn V rocket. The Gemini mission, 2 men, and the Mercury mission, 1 man, much smaller. At the time Kennedy made his announcement in 1961, only Alan Shepard had been into space, and he'd only gone up 60 miles and come straight down again. America were not doing very well in space. The Gemini mission was launched, it orbited the Earth, and then it came down. And the reason I'm querying Apollo is actually where it went. The reason is Apollo is the only mission we know of that is promoted as having gone beyond low Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit's 200 miles up. Not very far. The atmosphere, the Earth's atmosphere ends 60 miles up. That's not very far either. So Earth orbit, where the space station is, where the space shuttle goes, 200 miles above the Earth's surface. This is the Gemini mission. Small capsule landed in the Pacific. You've got 2 astronauts getting out, and you've got 2 frogmen who'd swum over from the helicopter. But what's this? It looks like a direction antenna. So in case it landed a long way off course, they could find it. Wouldn't it have got burnt off if it comes back through the atmosphere? It's a bit of an anomaly. There is supposedly an explanation for this, but it just is weird. It's the start of how things don't quite add up. Now, if you're going to go to the moon, you've got to take photographs, and this is the camera they use, the Hasselblad medium format, 70mm, or in old money, 2¼ inch square size negatives or transparencies. Bottom left is Neil Armstrong with his camera mounted on his chest, because there's no viewfinder in this camera. You couldn't, if you're wearing a spacesuit, you couldn't get your head down. If you look at the middle picture, that's where the viewfinder is, on top of the camera. The right-hand picture is Alan Shepard with his camera attached. So they had no viewfinder. Okay, that's not a problem, because they could point the camera with their body. And the photographs we'll look at later were all taken under those conditions, with no viewfinder. Manual control of every feature on the camera except the film advance. All right. I've been filmed for several documentaries, and one of them was History Channel, made about 10 years ago, and they borrowed the replica Hasselblad from Hasselblad UK, so I took the opportunity to photograph it. Top left-hand picture shows the film counter, the only means you will have of knowing if you've taken a photograph. Because normally when you click it, what you hear is the mirror going up. There's no mirror because they took the viewfinder away. So how do you know if you've taken a photograph? Bottom left, the little black square on the front of the camera is the shutter button. But you can't see that from inside a spacesuit. So how do you know you've pressed it? Moving on. The only way you could set the exposure is that little chart on the left-hand side on the top of the camera. And on the lens, that's the shutter speed. This may all sound extremely historical and a bit 20th century, but this is what they used. It is not a point-and-shoot camera. Hasselblad's a very good camera, but it's not a point-and-shoot camera. It's not a camera you can just whip out, pictures, pictures, pictures. It doesn't do that. You have to set the exposure, set the aperture, and focus it through the viewfinder, which you haven't got. So how do you know you've got it in focus? The focus is not automatic. On the right, I use those purely to illustrate one thing, which we'll come to later. Behind here is a fence. What that shows is the position of the camera that takes the picture. The top picture there was taken at eye level, and the bottom picture is taken at chest level. What it shows is how the horizon behind the picture will change. If you take a picture at eye level, the horizon is higher, apparently higher. This is nothing to do with, this is basic optics. You get down here, the horizon appears to go lower. You take a picture from a high level, the horizon appears higher. Now, if you're going to go to the moon, you've got to practice. You've got to do simulations, and these are the simulations that the simulated lunar surface on the bottom left, the globe that was made. It's in San Francisco now, you can go and see it. Also, sectors of the lunar surface were constructed from previously taken photographs on unmanned craft, so they knew what the thing looked like. The top photograph here shows the scale of some of these simulations, or simulated events. In Virginia is this contraption here, which was supposed to decide what it would be like to land in the lunar module, because on the Earth, on the moon, the gravity is much less than it is on Earth. This is all done quite openly. There's nothing secret about it. And forget Area 51, forget some secret film studio. That's nothing to do with what we're talking about here. And also, forget no stars in the sky as an explanation. Forget waving flags. They weren't stupid enough to leave doors open, for goodness sake. It's a good thing that the detractors of what I'm saying here can knock it down. I don't say anything about stars. I say nothing about waving flags. I will look at odd shadow angles, not because there are two light sources. There's only one light source, allegedly the sun. Anyway, let's get off to the moon. This is a Saturn V rocket, 3,000 tons. 99% of that weight was fuel to get the thing off the ground. And off it went, and as soon as it cleared the tower on the left there, communication switched from Florida to Texas, from Cape Canaveral, or Cape Kennedy as it became known later, to the control centers at the Johnson Space Center, named after President Johnson, at Houston in Texas. So from the moment it leaves that particular location, and you see it disappearing off into the sky, and 2 minutes after it launches, it's gone. You can't see it anymore because it's 50 miles away. The only source of information we have is NASA. There's no independent verification of anything that happened after launch until splashdown, when the parachutes opened and the capsule landed back in the Pacific. Now, in my view, NASA stands for Never a Straight Answer, as opposed to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which is the official title, but it could also stand for the National Academy of Space Actors, or Numerous Anomalies and Scams Abound. So you can have a lot of fun with the name. By the way, that Never a Straight Answer came from the New York Times, who were trying to get answers. Getting into space, you're going to come up against the temperature. What's the temperature of space? There's no temperature in space. There's nothing in space to have a temperature until you put something there, like the Earth or the Moon or a spacecraft, and then it will have a temperature. And what is that temperature? It's pretty hot. It's pretty hot.
There's no sunlight. It's in shadow.
If it's in shadow, it's very cold, because there's no atmosphere. There's this idea that they landed on the moon at an early morning, which they did, the sun was low over the horizon, therefore it was relatively warm, is nonsense. In space, it's hot or it's cold. It's plus 250, it's minus 250. End of story. That's space. What's the pressure in space? There's no pressure, it's a vacuum. So humans who can't survive in a vacuum, because our blood would boil, or rather the gases in our blood would tend to come out, like when you open a can of soft drink, you shake it up, the thing will spurt everywhere. That's the pressure being released. In space, we've got to take our own pressure, so we have a spacesuit. Radiation. Radiation in space is lethal to humans because it comes from the sun. Those black dots on the sun, those are the solar flares that we hear about. They're powerful enough to get through the Earth's atmosphere and knock out electrical power grids if it comes in the wrong direction. But we're protected on Earth from the radiation in space. You've got solar particle events from the sun, you've got galactic cosmic rays from deep space. Unpleasant stuff. Fortunately, here on Earth, we're protected by the Earth's magnetic field, which forms a shield to trap these protons and electrons whacking down on us, because what they do is they alter our DNA. That's the problem. So we have to protect against it. You may recall if you went through airport security a few years ago and you were carrying a film camera. Remember film cameras? Not digital cameras, film cameras. You were always told, give the guy get it hand searched. But don't put your camera through the X-ray machine because it'll fog the film. Let it be hand searched. And that was good advice because film is affected by radiation. Of course it is. That's what comes through the lens. Radiation, visible light. This is the photograph, Earthrise, which allegedly started the whole ecological movement because we could suddenly see how fragile our beautiful planet is in space. And this is the moon, we're told. It's a double exposure. It's very easy to do. Now, if you're going to land on the moon, you've got to have your spacecraft to do it in. And this is the position in which Neil Armstrong, who landed the craft manually, don't forget, there'd been a computer alarm, 1202 alarm, on a computer, which meant that he had to take over manual control and land the craft by hand. Here are our heroes. On the left, Buzz Aldrin. On the right, Neil Armstrong. Buzz Aldrin, so called because his sister couldn't pronounce the word brother, so she called him Buzz. And the word stuck. And that is why Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story is called Buzz Lightyear, because it's named after dear Buzz Aldrin, who's still alive, I think. Neil Armstrong died in 2012. Neil Armstrong is probably the most famous American of the 20th century. Where is he buried? Arlington National Cemetery, you'd expect, wouldn't you? That's where prominent Americans are buried, presidents and such like. No, he's buried at sea, off the coast of Florida. He was a naval pilot, so maybe it's reasonable that he should be buried at sea. But it seems a bit odd. But maybe I'm just being a bit cynical here. And if I do appear cynical and sarcastic, it's because I am. We have been fooled. Humans cannot travel beyond the radiation belts which protect us on Earth without a great deal of protection. We'll come to what happened later. Right, we're on the moon. We're going to get out of our spacecraft. This is Neil Armstrong taking the photograph of Buzz Aldrin staggering, crawling out from the Apollo 11 craft. And here he is a bit further down. Notice how well lit he is. Notice how beautifully illuminated. Now, Neil Armstrong was taking the photograph, obviously got bored stiff watching Buzz staggering out, so he decided to photograph the rubbish bag underneath the craft. This is the sequence of photographs. It's not my choice. We'll show you the exact sequence later. Photograph the rubbish bag and where's the blast crater? This is a 10,000 pound thrust rocket here, which has slowed the craft down from its orbit speed of 4,500 miles an hour. Faster than any aircraft can travel even today on Earth. So you've got to have a rocket to slow you down. 10,000 pound of thrust, that's quite a powerful rocket. Oh, I hear you say, no, they slowed it down. So it wasn't 10,000 pound, it was about 2,000 pound. And it was coming out of a nozzle here, which has an area of about 1,000 square inches. It's just over 30 inches in diameter. Therefore, it was only about 1 pound per square inch on the lunar surface. Rubbish. If you're coming down in a helicopter, would you expect the helicopter to turn its power off as it came near to the ground? No, this would produce a fairly powerful blast which should shift all this dust stuff here. You can see that it's fairly dusty, because we'll see footprints later. But there's no blast crater. There's no indication that this thing was working when it landed. Anyway, on with the photographs. He had to photograph the pads to make sure that they weren't damaged. So quite what he'd have done if they were, history doesn't relate. Oh, he's coming out a bit further now. You come back and take the photographs again. This is one of the most ridiculous photographs I have ever seen. He's supposedly on the moon. No atmosphere. He's in his spacesuit, which is cumbersome, difficult to move in. He can't see where he's put his feet. He's on a platform about 10 foot above the surface of the moon. He's going to come down the ladder, which he can't see from where he is. He can't see inside his spacesuit. His right foot is not touching the ladder, and his left foot has been kicked out. Would you come off your garage roof down a 10-foot ladder like that? Of course you wouldn't. You'd be looking to make sure that you got a proper foothold before you moved at all. And there's a big, difficult to see it on here, but there is padding on the ladder. So his foot won't even fit on the ladder, not very comfortably. This is as if he's done this maneuver about 100 times in a simulation, which he did. There's no secret about any of that. They did simulations. He's done about 100 of them. And assuming it's Buzz Aldrin, because we can't see his face, we only see his nameplate, which says E. Aldrin, Edwin Aldrin. We see him do that. He's probably doing it. He's done it 100 times. And he's now just saying, look, guys, I can really fool around on the top of this ladder. Because when you do a debrief after a simulation, you photographed it, you filmed it, you sit down, watch the films, look at the photographs and say, that's a good place to go. Don't do that again, you'll fall off. That's what a debrief is. This is a debrief. This is not taken on the lunar surface. Now, if anybody can prove me wrong, please do so. Here he is again. It's only his right foot on the ladder. It's not overexposed. This is the point. It's not overexposed. The directly illuminated surface of the moon is not overexposed, and yet he's lit up like a Christmas tree. Where's all that light coming from? Oh, it's the special reflected surface of the moon. Rubbish! The moon has a reflectivity of 8%. So 8% of the light hitting it from the sun, assuming it's the sun, 8% is reflected. That's why we can look at the moon up in the sky at night. We see it occasionally during the day, but you can't look at the sun because it's so bright. Very little light. So 8% is reflected. To say that 8% of the light reflected is enough to illuminate him, and for that to be recorded on the ectochrome film that was used in the camera, is photographically rubbish. It won't happen. There's another light source which we weren't told about. Standing in the footpad at the bottom. Beautifully illuminated, not overexposed. It's almost certainly a light source just to the right of the camera position. Those are the 8 photographs in sequence, and they were taken from the website I use is the Lunar and Planetary Institute website. There are about 4 or 5 different websites you can go to get Apollo photographs, and that's what they'll look like when you look at them on the. Notice the numbers. AS11, I don't know what AS actually stands for. We assume it stands for Apollo Saturn, but it could well stand for Apollo Simulation. In this case, mission Apollo 11. Magazine 40, it's just a number that is randomly chosen. There aren't 40 magazines of photographs. This happens to be the one on which shows the lunar moonwalk. There's 121 photographs on it, and that is just a randomly chosen number. But they're all in sequence. So those 8 photographs I showed, by the way, they took 3 minutes to photograph. Neil Armstrong had no viewfinder. And you may recall, if you are interested in the subject, that the company NVIDIA, who make graphic processing units, a very big company in America, have a rather interesting PR company. They promoted a crop circle to promote one of their previous GPUs, and they developed a new one. It's called Maxwell. And they emailed me and said, would I take part in their program that they were making? And I said, well, it sounds interesting. Let's do a bit of, see what you're going to be doing. And they told me what they were doing. They said, but because it's such a new piece of kit, you've got to sign a non-disclosure agreement so you don't talk about it if we show it to you. I said, I'm not signing a non-disclosure agreement. It's a good thing I didn't, because it would have given them legal authority to shut me up for 3 years. So that failed. Anyway, NVIDIA made the program, and they showed that they could recreate the photograph. In fact, it's that one that they use, one of those two. And they could do it in a computer, and they showed that it was all quite legitimate because there was sufficient illumination from the lunar surface and from Neil Armstrong, whose white spacesuit would reflect light. What they didn't know was that there are people around who are sufficiently computer savvy to work out what the reflectivity NVIDIA were using on the lunar surface, and it was 5 times the actual figure. So of course it would illuminate it. And Neil Armstrong and his spacesuit is not a big enough area to provide sufficient illumination. Otherwise you get photographic assistants wearing white coats and wandering around providing enough fill-in light. It just doesn't add up. Okay, footprint on the moon. We've been there. We got a footprint. How did he take the photograph? Camera on his chest. Did he bend forward? How did he know he'd get the picture correctly? How did he know he'd focused it correctly and got the right exposure? He only took one photograph. Photographic technique would be to take lots and lots and lots of pictures. No, one, that's enough. Got it right first time. It's rubbish, complete nonsense, fabrication. This is allegedly the only photograph of Neil Armstrong on the moon. Have you ever seen a photograph of Neil Armstrong on the moon? First man on the moon? Big hero? No. The story is that he refused to have his photograph taken on the moon. There was only one camera used, and he was using it, so he couldn't take his picture. The point about this picture is, look at the flag. American flag, fair enough, no problem with that. They were the guys who did it. They could stick their flag up where they like. Look at the position of the flag. Look at the horizon in relation to the flag. The horizon is virtually at the top of the flag. This would appear to be looking down on him, because here's another photograph. Look at the flag, look at the horizon. Remember we looked at that fence? This is taken from a much lower position. They landed in this Sea of Tranquility place, which is supposedly a big flat area. So the horizon isn't going to change very much. And yet we've got a photograph here with the flag in a very different position to this one, which indicates it was taken by a different camera position, almost as if he was up on a ladder. Again, this is the one-legged astronaut. He got his footprint there, but no footprint before it or after it. So was he hopping around? Quite possibly. 2 astronauts on the lunar surface at the same time. This is fine. There's another one we'll see later where it's not. This was taken from a film camera set to run at 1 frame per second the whole time they were out on the lunar surface for about 2 hours. Data acquisition camera, it was called, 16mm film camera. So these are the 2 astronauts, Aldrin, Armstrong. Why are their shadow lengths different? Why are the angles different? They landed apparently at the fairly early in the lunar morning, so the shadows were long, which would give good photographic rendition. These 2 here, one is 26 degrees, one is 35 degrees, but they landed when the sun was at 13 degrees. This is anomaly. which indicates that it was prefabricated, and this is probably the evidence for it. There's the flag, that's the TV camera, this is the film, this is a screenshot from the film, but the flag is in a different position. It's been twisted. Look at the shadow of the flag. The camera position is the same, or virtually the same. They didn't touch the flag after they put it in the ground. So why is in the film the flag at a completely different angle to that? More ridiculous photographs here. You're looking down on the astronaut, which means a very high camera position. And what are these things here? This is not lens flare. Hasselblad lenses do not flare like that. It's hard to see it, but there is actually lens flare about there, which is the shape of the Hasselblad lens. It's a six-sided shutter inside the lens. I don't know what these are, but they're not lens flare. So anomalies, unexplained details. Here is the famous man on the moon photograph. And here is a postcard. This is what I had to go and buy when I started looking at this, a set of postcards. There it is. Notice it's slightly different. It's just prettied up. It's a PR image. They put black in the top, shut it down. Astronaut Edwin Aldrin's faceplate reflects astronaut Neil Armstrong and the lunar module. Yes, it may well do. Any good photographer would set that up. I don't know what these are. Ladies' handbags, maybe. Obviously having a party on the moon. And here is the pristine pad. Nobody's told us that on the moon, lunar material will not adhere to anything that has come from Earth. It has to go somewhere completely different. This 10,000-pound thrust rocket, lowering it onto the lunar surface, scattering dust everywhere, and they commentate on it. Picking up some dust was a comment made. It was obviously enough, and they couldn't see that. That's why the alarm went off. The radar on the craft, which was measuring the distance they were going down, couldn't see through the dust being kicked up by the module, so they made a mistake there. But none of that dust managed to settle in this footpad, which is ridiculous. Two photographs taken showing Earth. How did they take that photograph? Think about it. The Earth, when viewed from the moon, will be more or less overhead. Because when we see the moon from Earth, we see the full face of the moon. And the moon orbits the Earth, and we see the face. If you're on the moon and you want to see where Earth is, it's more or less overhead from the equator, which is where they allegedly were. So how did they take this photograph? The Earth is at least 60 degrees above their position. The camera has an angle of view of 45 degrees. So in order to get the photograph we see here at the top, he would have to be leaning back so far, he'd be falling over. Have you tried leaning back at 45 degrees? Don't. You'll fall over. He's in a spacesuit, which is not very flexible anyway. Ah, you might say, he took the camera off his chest and pointed it up at the Earth. Maybe he did, but how did he know without a viewfinder he'd get the Earth in it? Anomaly. In many of the films of the Apollo missions, not just Apollo 11, there are the test strips here, which indicate, this is standard practice on film, you put it on the film camera. But note the date, the 11th of July, 1969, Apollo 11. Apollo 11 launched on July the 16th and landed on the moon, allegedly, on July 20th. But this is the film we saw earlier, taken from the lunar module. Hang on, what's going on? Why is the date 5 days before they launched? The photographer, we're told, is a chap called Gynes. He actually did work for NASA. You can Google it, check his name. Here's another one, because there were lots of films. They're only about 2 minutes long, some of them, because that's all the magazine held. So they had lots of different photographs, different films, all dated July 11. And if you do the same exercise for the other Apollo missions, you'll find exactly the same thing. A film that is dated a week before the mission took off. It's a very weird situation. Anyway, here are our heroes. Top one, Buzz Aldrin. Bottom one, Neil Armstrong. And I put it in that format because this was taken from a book bought at the Kennedy Space Center. So it's a NASA publication. And it reads, Astronaut Edwin Aldrin inside the lunar module after his moonwalk. That is a lie. If you find the original of that photograph, it was taken before they even reached the moon. He's got his Masonic ring on here, and he's putting his sunglasses in his pocket. It's a very comfortable piece of kit, and it's in a simulation rig. Same with the bottom one here, Neil Armstrong, inside the lunar module as it rested on the moon's surface. Now, what you see in here is a highlight of light. This is indicative of a flash gun being used. They didn't have a flash gun, but a highlight of light in the eye. If you look at any paparazzi photograph of any celebrity, you'll see a highlight of light in the eye because it indicates a flash gun is used to illuminate it. His teeth are also have a highlight there, which is the same thing. So this was taken under controlled conditions in the simulation rig before they even went to the moon. And it's a fabricated story, we have been told. This is Apollo 12. And this just shows, it's difficult to see it here, the bad retouching that was done where they tried to black out whatever was behind it. On Apollo 12, we have another series of 8 photographs, 2 of which include astronauts, Al Bean in this case. But just look at the position of the horizon relative to the astronaut, taken by the same photographer, Pete Conrad. Why is the horizon in such a different position when he's it's beautifully composed. It's a sequence of 8 photographs. Again, you can see them online now. And if you look at the the faceplate, the reflection in the faceplate, it's the sort of thing you would see. But then what's all this stuff on the left? There's those strange lights again. It's almost like they're studio lights. Or there's some form of errant inclusion. They shouldn't have included it. Again, this would indicate that it was taken at the correct level because his camera is on his chest, which indicates that that was where the photograph was taken from. But on this one, you're looking down on the camera because it's a higher camera position. And what's going on in his helmet? What are all these reflections? Is it E.T. come hurtling by to say, "Who the hell are these? What are they doing? Nobody gave them permission." I don't know. Could just be internal reflections in the helmet, but it's an unexplained detail, and NASA will not address it. NASA, when asked, by the way, to comment on some of these anomalies for a film that was being made by Sky Television, were doing the interviews, and they interviewed the PR guru at NASA, a guy with the name of Brian Welch, and he was asked to comment on these anomalies identified in some of the photographs. And he said, "We don't have time for this nitpicky claptrap." That is NASA's attitude towards anybody questioning them. I use this one purely to show that there are crosshairs here. A crosshair will appear in virtually all the Hasselblad images because there was a sheet inside the camera, a sheet of glass with crosshairs on it. Nobody really knows why they used them, but it's good to identify it as being taken on the moon. Now here's a photograph showing a very weird shadow angle. The sun is behind the photographer. Here's the photographer. Why is the angle of the shadow there, and this one here? Shadow behind the photographer who's there. What's this shadow doing here? Very weird. It's not two light sources. You wouldn't have that. You would get two different shadows if you did. Moving on to Apollo 14. Again, there's the sun. Very hard to photograph the sun in the photograph without it flaring out. We've got a beautifully illuminated shadow side of the lander. You can see all the detail you want to see. Where did that light come from? It wasn't the lunar surface. All right, this is the other photograph of two astronauts on the lunar surface, which is not okay. This is the Apollo 14 lander. Notice the position of the flag. Now, I just switch it over because that's how the flag is showing in this photograph. This is a photograph mounted at about that size in the Kennedy Space Center. It's taken from Alan Shepard's book called Moonshot, where he hit a golf ball on the moon. You can't see a golf ball traveling across your field of vision. You can see a golf ball moving towards you because it's traveling too fast. But on the moon, magic happens. Alan Shepard, Ed Mitchell, two astronauts on the lunar surface. This is a photograph. There's a crosshair there, there's one there. It's a montage, and it can be demonstrated to be a montage. The flag, you recall it was up here. It's nowhere near the position it was supposed to be in. There's the flag there, right next door to the lunar module. So what's it doing here? Moved across. Because there are 5 images in this photograph. So when NASA were asked to explain this anomaly, that this was supposedly a photograph, it came out of Alan Shepard's book, they took it down. It hasn't been seen since. That's the TV image of the same scene. Moving on to Apollo 15, this is the Apollo 15 landing site. This is what's called the Hadley Rill, which is a collapsed volcanic tube. Nobody knows this. It could be, ET's got a load of JCBs up there and they've dug a drainage trench. Could be any explanation. But this is the landing site, and from the ground, this is what it looks like, with this mountain in the background. This is Mount Hadley Delta. We're told it's 13,500 foot high. All right. From the landing craft to the top of that mountain is about 7 miles. You can check this out. US Geological Survey has some very accurate maps showing all these features on the lunar surface with measurements. Now, if you're 7 miles away from a location and the mountain should be about 2 miles vertically above you, on Earth this is what it would look like. Mount Everest is 29,000 feet. Everest Base Camp is about 19,000 feet. So it's 2 miles vertically above base camp. It's about 7 miles as the crow flies, if there have been any crows flying anywhere near Mount Everest. So it's the same relative positions as that. Does it look like it? And why is there a very distinct line between the foreground image here and the background? They're using the best lenses, the Hasselblad lenses. This is a Hasselblad photograph. But the background goes into sort of blurry nonsense. You can't see any detail at all. Mount Everest, you can see the detail you expect to see. So the previous image is a fabrication. Here's a mystery. This is Dave Scott, photographed by Jim Irwin. Here's Jim Irwin. Dave Scott, he's got a camera on his chest. The next image, and I've checked these numbers to make sure they are consecutive, and they are. The next image is Jim Irwin, photographed by Dave Scott. He hasn't got a camera. Anomaly. because they didn't take the camera off and hand it over to the next guy. Where's the flag? Flag's first thing erected. That was similar to the previous image. But in this photograph here, it's flags. Where's it gone? Memo to set dresser. Remember the flag. This just illustrates the anomaly about the lunar rover. The little car. Do you know what that car cost? $60 million. There's 3 of them. They're on the moon. And they could drive, we're told, as far as an electric car can drive today. This was the mid-1960s. It was developed by the Boeing Aircraft Corporation and General Motors.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. We're off. Right. Any astronomers here? Okay, I've got a question. If you want to pass it on to an astronomer. This is the Apollo 17 landing site. They landed more or less this is the valley that they landed on. This is Apollo 11 landing. This is the terminator, the difference between light and dark. On a circular body, it will, like we've got it on Earth, it's called dusk. Where is it in this photograph? There should be a terminator. The shadow lengths are the same or similar, not visible. The famous photograph of Apollo 17 of the Earth here. How did he take that photograph? With no viewfinder. I've tried to do it, tried to recreate it, person, flag, the moon. With no viewfinder, it's very hard to do it once. That's all they did. They had magic on the moon. This indicates what is likely to be the screen in the background. It's front screen projection, which is a known cinema technique. When you enhance the contrast, this is the type of artifact you get, which indicates that they were using front projection. Right, in that photograph is the lunar lander on Apollo 17. Can you see it? No, you won't be able to. But it is there. And just to show, enlarging that photograph, there's the lunar lander. In that photograph, it's a huge, that's what we just looked at. The big photograph here is what we just looked at. But there are other photographs showing the lunar lander with this feature identical in each of the 3 photographs. These are other features which are identical in the photographs. B here, little crater. The lunar lander was not supposed to have been moved once it got onto the lunar surface. But it jumps around all over the place. There's the lander. What's it doing over here when these features are the same? This is ridiculous. And we're expected to believe it. And we go along with it. If you want to believe man landed on the moon, please go ahead and do so. I believe in 3 things. Father Christmas, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny. For everything else, I want evidence. This is not evidence. We come on to the lunar rover here. Again, it just shows where's it gone. The lunar rover that magically leaves no tracks when it's parked. When it drives around, we see it leaving tracks. You'd expect something weighing on Earth 450 pounds, on the moon about 60, a bit more than that, 70 pounds. You expect it to leave a few tracks. There are footprints there, but there are no tracks in front of it or behind it. Anomaly. This is what the tracks look like. The trouble is 134204007, and then the 6 photographs later we have the tracks. Or did they change the tire, make them a different track? Herringbone pattern as opposed to square cut. Again, anomaly, different. When Apollo 17 or any of them took off, they took off, and this was filmed from the camera mounted on the lunar rover, controlled from Earth by Ed Fendall, who was operating the camera on a 2.5 second time delay. And they got it to launch by pressing button A, marked launch, presumably, because suddenly it leaps up off here. Where's the rocket thrust? It's using hypergolic fuel, which is the same as used on the space shuttle, which is visible in space. but there's none visible here. And if you look at the launch pad, this is the lower section of the Apollo 17 or any of the Apollo landers. Where did the exhaust go? That's not a hole. It's a flat surface. If you fire a 4,500-pound rocket literally underneath you with nowhere for the exhaust to go, guess what? You're toast. You're dead. You're gone. But there's magic on the moon. And Apollo 17 launched with nowhere for the exhaust to go. This is the photograph that Ben showed yesterday. It's the photograph most people are familiar with. And you can always tell it's got a little triangle of light over the Sudan. It's the only photograph of the Earth from space. Everything else is a computer image. When you're coming back to Earth, you come back in your capsule and you've got to have a heat shield to stop you frying, because the frictional forces of the atmosphere when you hit it, 60 miles up, don't forget, you're traveling at 25,000 miles an hour, you've got to slow down. So use a heat shield to use the friction of the atmosphere to do it. What temperature does that heat shield achieve? It's 2,700 degrees centigrade. We'll come back to it in just a minute, but let's have a look at the Russians, who should have blown the whistle, surely, if this was all going wrong. No, they didn't. We got the moon rocks. Here's a piece of moon rock. Anybody want to see a piece of moon rock? Piece of moon rock. It's called breccia. Nice piece of moon rock. And the reflectors, oh, good heavens. If reflectors on the moon, you don't need them. MIT, who are a pretty good scientific organization, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, were firing lasers at the moon in 1962 and getting a reflection back and picked up on a big receiving dish. The Crimea Astrophysical Laboratory, in, believe it or not, Crimea, i.e. Soviet Union, were doing the same thing in 1963. The British Army were firing radar at the moon and getting a reflector. You don't need a stupid reflector here on the moon, put there by astronauts who weren't there in the first place, to get a laser to reflect back. You just fire it at the moon, it comes back. The Russians didn't blow the whistle because they had far more important things to worry about. We've heard quite a lot about the Russian natural gas reserves. They're being exported into Europe because Russia has very few natural resources, but he has an abundance of gas, and it comes into Europe. And the contract to supply the first deal was signed in 1968 between Andrei Gromyko and West Germany, as it was then, Austria and Italy. So they weren't going to call time on some ridiculous photographs that America said were taken on the moon when they had far more important things to worry about. The famous rock that the Rijksmuseum looked at when they did their renovation, and it's fake, it's a piece of wood. Ah, I hear you say, but they've taken photographs of the landers on the lunar surface. Yes, that's what they told us they've done. But they need a whacking great arrow to show anything in the photograph. If you looked at Google Earth, and you've looked at your own house and looked at a car parked outside your house, you can see if it's got a sunroof and which way the car is pointing. And you can probably see some nice chairs in your garden if you've got any. You can see quite a lot from a satellite 400 miles up through the atmosphere of Earth, but this is 60 miles up, and you can't see more than 2 pixels from a high-tech orbiting satellite. I don't believe it, and I've heard of Photoshop too. A photograph taken on the moon, this was done by the Lunar Orbiter in 1966, showing it's not an impact crater, by the way, Copernicus, or most of the other flat-bottom craters. They're electrical discharge craters. That's an impact crater on Earth, Arizona, meteor crater. And the bottom one is what happens when you let a nuclear bomb off. It makes a crater too. On the moon, this photograph is the only one I've found for many years. it shows an object moving across the lunar surface taken in 1966, i.e. before any alleged landings. There are two objects here, one here, small one here, big one. I don't know what they are, but they are leaving a track which is identifiable. I knew where it's a Vitello crater, bottom left-hand corner of the moon. When Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter went out, I thought I could find that image again if it exists, and it does exist. There it is 50 years later. Sun angle is different, but I don't know what it is. I know what I think it is, but let's not go there. We've got to get back to Earth. You're coming in. So if you're going to have a heat shield, which is on the bottom here, you don't need one on the side here because you've got all these nice aluminium panels which melt at 600 degrees. But yes, strange, on the latest Orion mission, they've got heat shield all over it, as if they were expecting the thing to be damaged by re-entry. That was flown in December 2014. It hasn't flown since because the heat shield on the bottom was demonstrated to be incapable of protecting any humans inside. That's the one you can see in the Science Museum today, and this is the alleged new development. NASA are beginning to find out that Apollo was a myth, and it's been a big detriment and drag on space exploration ever since. And here are the three naughty little schoolboys caught smoking behind the sheds who allegedly landed on the moon. Don't you think they might be a bit more cheerful? But no, they're being asked to lie to the world's press, and they really were unhappy about it. Getting to the moon really isn't a problem. It's quite easy. It's been done many times by quite a few different nations. It's getting humans there and back again. That's the hard part. That's what I contend has never happened. Humans on the moon. And I'm at Astronaut 4 on this one. Bottom right. Because that's who I think had a lot to do with it, Walt Disney. His stock in trade was fantasy, and that is what Apollo is. Apollo is a fantasy. That's a website I could recommend if you want hours and hours of good reading about it. If you want to see lots of YouTube films, moonfaker.com is Australian, it's Jarrah White. Takes on anybody who disagrees with his contention, which is the same as mine, that we never landed on the moon. I haven't covered Apollo 13, which was actually, the capsule came down in the Atlantic. It was recovered by the Soviet Navy, taken to Murmansk, picked up by Americans and brought back. It's now out on display in a museum in Kansas. You haven't heard that story? No, thought not. There's photographs of it in Murmansk being handed over. Apollo command module. Leave here without Nexus and you're uninformed, because Nexus covers all this sort of subject. We're on the stand there. So thank you very much for your attention.